Imagine you're a podcast host of a podcast that gets tens of thousands of downloads every single month, and in your inbox there are 2 emails. In email number 1, the subject line reads, "Opportunity to chat." You click into it, and the opening paragraph says, "Hi name, my name is," insert name, "and I am the founder of," insert company name, "and I would love to be a guest on your show." That's the first pitch's opener. Now there's a second pitch. This pitch, the subject line says, "Podcast guest pitch, how to embrace rejection." You click into it, and the opener is a little bit different. This time it says, "Hi, first name. I recently listened to your episode with," insert guest name, "and I got goosebumps when you mentioned how doing what you love is a game changer for those with ADHD. This has certainly been true for me, even if it is a daily practice." Full stop. Which one would pique your interest more? I think it's an easy answer, and the second introduction is actually something I pulled from a real pitch that I sent to a podcast that has tens of thousands of downloads every month, and I went on as a guest recently on this show. So my name is Draper, and I am the founder of Hustling Writers, which is a podcast guest booking agency. For the past 5 years, we've landed our clients on thousands of podcasts, including many of the biggest and best in the world. And if I could distill everything I've learned down to one thing, it would be this. Podcast hosts do not ignore pitches because the guest isn't interesting or impressive enough. But podcast hosts do ignore pitches because the pitch is not specific or interesting enough. Big differentiator there. It's not about you not being interesting, it's about your pitch not being interesting. I would argue that 90% of what makes a podcast host say yes to you comes down to how good you are at pitching yourself rather than how glamorous or impressive your portfolio and bio is. I certainly don't have a glamorous and impressive portfolio, but I do know how to pitch well. So most guests and agencies make one fatal mistake, and that is that they pitch a bio instead of a story. I've worked as a podcast producer for a couple of clients. I've also done my own work and running my own podcast, and 90% of the pitches that come through, more than 90%, I'd say 99% of the pitches that come through are a long generic bio. Lots of accolades, accomplishments, who you are, what you've done with your life, and very little story, very little actionable, relevant takeaways. So let's dive into the anatomy of a pitch that gets an immediate yes. What does a great podcast pitch actually look like? What is the easiest way to stand out? The first topic that I'm going to dive into is personalization. So the easiest way to get ignored is to send a generic copy-paste pitch. It's also to say something like, "I love your show," because no one believes that. That's what everyone says. So instead of starting a pitch off with something generic like, "I love your podcast and I would love to be a guest," try something a lot more specific and personalized. Take a listen to an episode. If you don't have all the time in the world, click play in the middle of an episode and pull out a hyper-specific detail. Did the podcast host or the guest say something that you can quote back to them? Can you make a comment? Maybe they're talking about weight loss in an episode and you could say, "Oh my gosh, I have also fallen for the weight loss industry and I would love to be on your show to discuss XYZ related topic." The more specific and less broad you open with, the more authentic the pitch feels, the more likely they are to keep reading, which right now is our number one agenda. We want the host to keep reading. So have a great specific opener. I know that some of us like to have templates. It can make it easier to get started. So if you need a template on how to personalize your pitch, try this. Open the pitch with, "I really appreciated your episode with guest name." About specific insight. The more specific, the better. The way you framed key takeaway really stood out to me because I've experienced something similar. And now you need to go and explain what that something similar is in a very simple, succinct way. You can play around here, but really your goal is to be as specific as possible and avoid broad, generic, sweeping statements like, I love your show, because no one believes that. Secondly, which is very important, and if there's one thing I hope you take away from this, is please focus on having a strong narrative hook. In other words, lead with intrigue. We live in an attention economy. People do not have time. Oh my God, Adam Grant rejected me, ? That is what I opened that pitch that I read out earlier with. Another shocking takeaway you could open with could be 2 weeks after reporting an instance of workplace harassment, I was fired. Another one could be, I almost shut down my business 5 times before figuring out the system that saved it. These hooks work because they create an open loop to something intriguing that the host needs to know more. Again, our agenda is very simple here. Keep the host reading. Next, can you add an element of timeliness? So if you have a great story and you know that this is something that really is relevant to the podcast you're pitching and you've hit the mark, it's personalized, and there's a great story angle, adding an element of timeliness can become that competitive edge that puts your great pitch above the other great pitches. Because at this point, something that will be going through the host's mind is, why should my listeners be interested? Why would my listeners be interested in this? There are, of course, many evergreen angles. So I'm not saying don't pitch your evergreen angles, but if you can tie your pitch to anything upcoming, whether it's Mental Health Awareness Month or Women's History Month, or things happening in the news, what's happening in the election cycle, what's happening in politics, what is happening in the workplace, that all gives the host an extra reason to choose your pitch over other great pitches. One important caveat here is that many podcast hosts, especially for bigger podcasts, plan their cycles months in advance. So you probably want to be pitching 3+ months out of whatever, like if you're pitching around a specific date or month, you would probably want to be pitching about 3+ months out. If it's more generic kind of news cycle things, then just start pitching now. But, being able to blend an evergreen topic with a timely topic can push your pitch from good to really, really, really great. The fourth thing that I want to talk about of having value-driven speaking points. This is, I'd say, second to having a great story. This is top tier. This is the most important thing. Because at this point, now if the podcast host likes the fact that this was a really personalized, specific pitch, they like the fact that you have an interesting story, they're intrigued, they want to know more, the next question on their mind is, what is my audience going to get out of this episode? You want to make this as clear and valuable as possible. So a bad example would be saying something like, I want to talk about my entrepreneurial journey. Not very specific. Going back to the pitch that I sent to that podcast with tens of thousands of downloads, the pitch subject line was how to embrace rejection. I had a very shocking opener, which is, Adam Grant just sent me a rejection note, ? Capital letters. Okay, why am I asking about that? Then I lead in to how this was exciting for me because it was a champagne rejection, a rejection that I got excited about because it was someone I respect, look up to, who wrote to me personally in a very nice way. Then there's the speaking points. Here are some examples of what I wrote in this pitch of very specific, actionable speaking points. Here is what we can talk about. And then I have 3 bullet points. These 3 bullet points, the first one says, building a rejection resilience muscle. This includes assessing your relationship with rejection, creating and fostering a rejection community, habituating using micro-rejections, and accurately tracking and analyzing data. Topic 2, the science of rejection. It is supposed to hurt. Our ancestors' survival literally depended on not getting rejected. Topic 3, setting a rejection goal to land PR. A 100 rejections goal is how I built a career as a freelance journalist years ago. We can talk about leveraging a rejection goal to land PR in podcasts and publications and what it takes to write an excellent pitch. So I share those examples because I want to make it very clear that the more specific your speaking points are, the more likely you are to get a yes. The hosts want to know whether you can share advice and insights that is different to what all the other people pitching them have said. So when you're working on building out your own speaking points, try to get as specific as possible. And I know I use this word a lot. You don't want to have broad sweeping statements, but you want to get down to the nitty gritty, tactical and tangible strategies that you can share rather than big picture, holistic things. You could also say to ChatGPT, use ChatGPT as a way of getting yourself to think more specific and fine tune your ideas more. So you could take a pitch that you have already written and say to ChatGPT, this is too generic. Please, can you break this down into 10 micro topics? And then maybe those micro topics are still too generic. And you could say, please break those down into 10 even more micro topics. The more micro those topics are, the more specific they are, the more likely they are to be interesting and relevant to the podcast host. So at this point, we have an interesting subject line that made the host open the email. We have a personalized opener that showed the host that you actually listened to the show. We have an interesting, shocking, specific, and relevant story opener that makes the host want to know more about your story. We have valuable speaking points that are relevant to the show, and there is an element of timeliness to what's happening currently in the world, if possible. Now, the podcast host, if they are still reading and they're interested in what you have to say, they have one final question on their mind. Can you pull this off? Your job here is to make it as easy as possible to prove that the answer is yes. So demonstrate your credibility. You want a bio, a very short bio that does not have a laundry list of accomplishments, but it does demonstrate your capabilities, your accomplishments, and it includes links. We want to link. If you have spoken at a TED Talk, link to that TED Talk. If you have features in Forbes, link to those features in Forbes. If you have spoken on other podcasts, link preferably to one place where all the podcast interviews you've done are. They want to know that you can talk well, that you can deliver a good interview, and you don't want them to go Google, because when you make them Google, you're adding friction to this process, and they might not come up with the things you want them to see. They might not come up with the best talks you've given. If you link to that, they're more likely to take a listen to exactly what you wrote. So going back to my pitch, this is how I present my bio and my links. Inside, after the speaking points, where I spoke about what I would talk about in the podcast pitch, I just wrote, who am I? I am the founder of Hustling Writers, a podcast guesting agency that has secured clients on thousands of podcasts, including many of the top 0.5% shows. My newly launched podcast, My Rejection Story, features interviews with Neil Patel, Jason Van Ruler, and Gay Hendricks. I have written for HuffPost, Refinery29, Business Insider, and more. Some of my favorite things include strong coffee, affordable travel hacks, and deep connections. I detest small talk, waking up early, and unnecessary jargon. And then I have links to my website, my LinkedIn, and my past podcast appearances. And I have also hyperlinked the places that I have written for. Do you think this conversation is a good fit for podcast name? I'm happy to brainstorm other ideas too. So to close off this talk, I'm going to give you a 5-minute fix for better pitches. If your pitches aren't landing, you don't need to scrap everything and start over. You just need to tweak how you're presenting yourself. And here are 5 questions you can ask to do a better job. Is my opening hook strong enough to stop the scrolling? We're all scrolling. We're not looking at all of our emails. You need to grab their attention. 2, does my pitch show that I actually know the show? Very important. 3, have I made it clear why this interview would be valuable to their audience? 4, is there a reason for them to book me now instead of later? And 5, am I making it easy as possible for them to say yes? So my challenge for you is, before you send out your next podcast pitch, take 5 extra minutes to refine it. Cut out the fluff, lead with a strong hook, and give the host something that they can't ignore. Because at the end of the day, hosts do not book guests based on credentials alone. They book guests who bring a compelling story, a fresh perspective, and something that the audience can't wait to hear. So, who's ready to go out and get more podcast bookings?